Recruiter Show. I'm your host, Donnie Gupton. And on this show, we are bringing to life the stories of recruiting firm owners as they're opening up and sharing transparent about their wins. And today I've got a really awesome guest. I was talking to my friend Ben Bonnell a couple weeks ago, and he said, hey, you got to meet Ben Hansen. And today that's who is on the show. Ben Hansen, also known as the Profit Doctor. Now, Ben helps CEOs of staffing and recruiting companies maximize their profitability and set the stage for wealth, health, and happiness so they can give back to their community. Now, Ben isn't just, making stuff up and creating things out of thin air. Ben has created and named himself the Profit Doctor after 10 years of owning staffing and recruiting company and achieving 5 years consecutively on the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies, as well as a lot of other accolades. So we're going to hear Ben's story, and then Ben's going to dive into some myths around profit. And we're just going to dig into profit in general as it pertains to owning a recruiting firm. So Ben, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Hey, thanks, Donnie. I really appreciate having me. I'm looking forward to reaching out to some agency owners in that staffing, recruiting, and consulting space. It sounds like you've got a bunch of soon-to-be agency owners who are either independents or considering it. And I think we've got some good stuff for you. But I think you were asking me a little bit about my background. My background was mostly in initially sales, and then I got my MBA here at UT, boom. And then I got into the tech marketing side. So some startups and Dell, and then Microsoft. At Microsoft, I was a marketing manager in the Windows group, and I hired a lot of marketing managers to do various project and program management stuff for me. And after about 6 or 7 years, it occurred to me that many of the people who I had hired and then started their own agencies based on essentially working for me, I could maybe follow that route. So I left in 2007 to start Mactus Group. And my joke was I started a company to sell what I used to buy to the people I used to work with. So, very common path in the industry would be people who work at, let's say, a Fortune 1000 type company and then depart and become a consultant to that company and then think to themselves, maybe rather than just be a, one person show, I'm going to kind of branch out and make it more like an agency of some style. So that's kind of how I got into the business. And over the next, 8 years or so, we went from just Ben to about 100 folks on the payroll, so to speak, and nearly $13 million in revenue, and a bunch of those Inc. 5000 awards and whatnot. And that's kind of how I kind of got into the business.
Love it. Love it. I appreciate that overview. And for those of you that are with us live, if you can let us know that you're here, give a like, a comment, and feel free to ask Ben any questions about his experience as well as profitability. Looking back over your career, what are some of the standout moments that have defined your approach to running a successful recruiting firm, do you think?
Super good question. Somewhat ironic, maybe not ironically, fortunately, I've always been a bit of a pricing nut. Actually, back at UT, this must have been in like 95. I took like a weekend course with this professor who was a pricing expert. And it really got me thinking, wow, pricing is this huge lever that, so many businesses are just kind of spitballing on pricing without really getting into it. Mm-hmm. And just to fast forward, 10 more years, when I started my company, the first thing I started with was an Excel spreadsheet where I had all my levels of consultants. Actually, it was across the top, all my levels of consultants, and then my pricing model for each one. So what I would pay them and my taxes and my insurance and all that. And I really came to the conclusion that if I went with skinny margins, I would have to sell a lot. And I kind of thought of myself as a little on the lazy side. And I'm like, wait a minute, I could sell half as many deals and get the same amount of profitability, if I had another 5 or 10 points of gross margin to start with. And I'm like, that makes sense for me because I want to focus on quality. I want to get really top end candidates. And in my mind, the top end candidate was worth 5 or 10% more than the next tier of candidates, but 5 or 10% more in terms of top line pricing ended up, by the time it all trickled down through everything else, to basically being twice as many dollars in my pocket. Or another way to look at it is, with half as many people, billing, I could make the same revenue.
Right.
So that was probably one of the, is it a hugest lesson? One of the biggest takeaways from my time with Mactus Group, and one of the kind of core keys to my success.
Right.
Was sort of pricing, margin, and I did back that up with the quality and the service and the focus that allowed us, let's say, to charge that premium pricing.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you look back, I mean, what was there a specific moment where it was like, all right, we need to shift from, because I think that this is a really important part. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, which is like, we're also kind of programmed to like just sprint and like heads down, build revenue, sell more, sell more, sell more. Was there a moment where you're like, pump the brakes? If I just, you've talked about, hey, if I just switch this from focus on, the bottom line, that's going to take this to a whole nother level. Like, was there a significant challenge that came up, or was it just you looking at it?
It's very interesting when I do my work now and consult with CEOs of staffing and recruiting companies. On the one hand, I try to draw lessons from the smart things that I did as a business owner, and then draw the lessons from the other things I did, not in the smart camp. And then certainly, since I've migrated towards this path, I've really done a lot of my own research. That's kind of a preamble to, this would be maybe a story of what not to do. Probably about year 3, could have been year 4 into it. We were growing the first year or two, percentage growth numbers are kind of misleading. But, there was a period of about 5 to 8 years where we were growing probably 40% a year. That was kind of our growth path. In a very intentional way, somewhere around year 3, I had the idea that some of my key customers were being driven by procurement things, procurement thinking, or big procurement thinking. And so they wanted to work with fewer, larger vendors. And so I figured to myself, I needed to get bigger, or maybe that was going to really put me at risk.
Right.
And so kind of ironically, there was a period from about year 3 to maybe year 11 where I went from, let's call it $2.5 to $4 million of revenue up to about $12 or $13 million of revenue. But the number of dollars that went in my pocket did not increase, like on an annual basis. And so in a way it was intentional, because I told myself I needed to get bigger, and I was willing to do it even if I was, profit neutral, because I thought that would kind of keep me in the game. But what I didn't really factor on is all of the other downstream effects of, so let's say there's 4 people who are non-billable, and you've got your Cracker Jack team and you're crushing it. And you're putting a nice check in your pocket every month, and things are going great. And then all of a sudden now you've got 12 non-billable people and you're putting the same check in your pocket. But then there's a lot more variability. There are a lot more things that are difficult to control. And in many cases, when the margin or the net margin goes down, it is often a reflection of you're doing a lot of dumb things or a lot of inefficient things. And I ended up finding myself as a company doing a lot of not great things. And so, kind of play that lesson forward. One of the biggest challenges that I see for agency owners and staffing and recruiting, as well as, frankly, all sorts of small businesses, is this, what I call it, one of the most important growth myths, which is growth. And in many cases, people are sacrificing growth for profitability. And I think what's kind of happened here is people are, they're turning on the news, whatever that is, Inc. magazine, Fast Company, Wall Street Journal. And what they're seeing is all these stories about, Silicon Valley, VC-backed SaaS unicorns, billion-dollar exits and all that. And they're thinking that's the playbook for me. The problem is, we'll just pretend that's a lacrosse playbook that, 1/2 of 1% of like high school athletes in America, sorry, lacrosse people, I don't know how many percent actually play, but if meat and potatoes in America is football, baseball, and basketball, the VC-backed SaaS playbook is lacrosse. Sorry, kind of a bad example, but something really obscure, much more obscure than lacrosse. Anyway, so people are using the wrong playbook. If you're in staffing and recruiting, you don't have endless access to capital. You certainly will not have easy and cheap access to capital when you're hurting and need it and it's a down market. And ultimately, you won't be evaluated by top line revenue if somebody goes to buy your company or evaluate it. It'll be based on profitability and EBITDA. So I guess I'd just say that lesson that I learned by doing it the wrong way about sacrificing, growth for profitability percentage is now one that I really lead with my clients about making sure they're not going down the wrong path on that one.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I would be curious, how much do you think, because I think this is really, really important, how much do you think ego comes into play with this, right? So you mentioned like everybody sees all these, Silicon Valley tech people looking to exit. And I've even caught myself in this, which is, hey, like the ego wants to run $1 million business, for example, but hey, I could be way more profitable with not, right? But I think that a lot of people get obsessed with, well, I need to have $1 million business, for example. And that's just the number I'm picking, right? But like, what's your experience, for you first personally? Do you think your ego is a little bit involved? And the second, with you coaching people, are you seeing that being a part of it? Do you feel like that's, something that's getting people to kind of shoot for the wrong stars, so to speak?
Yeah, Donnie, super good question. There's like so many ways to kind of take that answer. I think the short version is yes, ego is a big part of that. I know that when I was living large and getting the plaques and growing 40% a year, and everybody asks you how big is their, oh, well, your company's only 2 million. Well, mine was 8 last year and 10 this year, and blah blah blah. There's definitely I won't say an opportunity, a trap in there, but also there's a lot of other layers in there. One of them is here in the United States, culturally, it's not appropriate to ask people how much money they make. Is sort of the standard thing. So the yardstick people are using for success or what you could ask somebody or whatever, often is more like a top line number. So many business owners are, first of all, they're very tight-lipped with their financials to their employees. Is that good or bad? I'm not 100% sure on that one. That one is maybe case by case. But most business owners are pretty thrilled to talk about top line with anybody who will listen. And so that becomes like the yardstick that people measure things by. And if, what measures, what gets measured matters, or is that wrong? Sorry, just kind of my train of thought there. So it's the ego on the inside, but then there's that sort of game on the outside where people can talk about revenue like politely in conversation, and it's normal and it's what's tracked and measured. And so that kind of reinforces that loop. And so everybody's growth. And, one of the challenges is I think when so don't get me wrong, at ProfitDoctor, we're big fans of growth. Don't get me wrong. But we don't figure that the right approach is get really big and then fix profitability. We want to fix profitability now and then scale that highly profitable engine. So let me just throw it back to you before I just keep spinning on that topic, because I think I could go like the whole hour on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. This is awesome. Real quick, Rebecca Williams-Gaines, how many years of experience do you think is a minimum requirement to get started? I've only been recruiting for 2 years. Previously was in operations and clinical research, some transferable skills. So Rebecca, I'm going to guess that you're talking about getting started in the recruiting business. I'm more of the thinking of today, build your own dream now rather than somebody else's. But Ben, what is your thoughts on that?
Boy, that is, there's a lot of ways to take that. Let me just start with sort of two ends of the spectrum. One is run right out now and hang your shingle and learn stuff the hard way. I think that is a very powerful technique to kind of light a fire under your butt and get after it. You'll learn very quickly, but man, it can be expensive in so many different ways, right? And then maybe on the other, our pictures are kind of skinny, so you can't really see a lot of that hand motion. But over there on the other side is the idea that you could go work somewhere else where they know what they're doing, and you could kind of get trained up and learn a lot that way. I guess what I would say is the first thing is don't go that second path unless you're working somewhere where they are doing some of the best practices. So the last thing you would want to do is like get 5 or 10 years of experience and learn how to do it wrong
and then go
when
to
you
market,
could probably be making the same money or double working somewhere where they're really doing it right. Okay. So if you're going to take the path of, I quote, need some more experience, really probably to the extent that you can afford to, optimize learning ahead of salary. Now, I'm not saying don't make more money. I like making more money. But I think the most important priority is for every year that you're, quote, getting experience, like really, I'm in training. I want to be here for a reason and learn stuff. What I'll also say is I think there's 2 pathways to sort of being that agency owner. I mean, there's a zillion pathways. But if you could say, one pathway is being in sales and recruiting, being sales or recruiting or account management in a staffing, recruiting, consulting company, and kind of learning that way and then building up and then crossing over to running your own company or having your own agency. I think that's probably the bulk of how people get into it. It's tried and true. I think it works well. I went a different way, which is, when I kind of slid over, if you will, into starting my own company in that regard, I was trading on the idea that I was a seasoned marketing, hiring manager, that sort of thing. And I didn't think of myself as recruiter first. I thought of myself as hiring manager first. So when I evaluated talent, I'm like, if I were still a group manager over at Microsoft, would I hire this person on my team? And then when I was talking to my clients, other marketing managers at Microsoft, typically, it was, I've sat in your shoes. I know what it's like to tell the difference and evaluate roles and fit and so forth. So I'm coming to you less as a recruiter and more as like a peer hiring manager, not pure, but peer. And so I think you can go either way. I think somewhere when you were reading Rebecca's, I thought you said she was in, was it clinical operation? Yeah, there you go. I don't know if you're going into it as a recruiter or with a background in that sort of subject matter expertise of clinical operations. But, I wrote a little cheat sheet of points to talk about with Donnie, and I'll jump ahead a little bit. One of them was, I think, a very, very powerful tool for both agency owners and individual recruiters is this, phrase, we might call it like the riches are in the niches. And the idea here is, you can say, I'm a great sourcer, a great recruiter, I can fill any role. But if you spend 10 years filling any role, in year 11, are you really any better at any particular kind of role than, we'll just say, another person who spent their first 3 years focusing on, clinical or operations research. I got it backwards there. Operations and clinical research, recruiting of whatever those people look like. And I would argue that third year person probably has a better Rolodex, a better understanding of who makes the right candidates, a better conversation track and expertise in talking with clients in that regard. So I think I've kind of skittered across 2 or 3 topics there. How many years does it take? I don't know that it's one size fits all, but I would definitely bring it back to, you can go early and kind of take your lumps and figure it out. I think it depends a little bit. Are you kind of a figured out person, or do you need a little bit more of a blueprint? If you need a bit more of a blueprint, I'd probably say, work for somebody else for a bit. And then in that regard, I would absolutely recommend work somewhere where they know what they're doing versus somewhere where they're just like full on playing the numbers game. Like, we'll bring in a whole bunch of junior people. We'll throw them against, throw him against the wall is the wrong word, but, they'll throw stuff against the wall and, 20% of them will stick a few years and then we'll see what we got. I don't know if you want to be in that kind of environment.
Excellent. Appreciate that feedback, Ben, and Rebecca. If you can go in that comment and let us know if you have any follow-up questions or if you like that, we'd appreciate it. Kind of going back into the profit side of things, we talked about, growth being kind of the biggest myth, that growth is going to equal more profit. What would you say, or one or two other kind of common myths that you address with recruiting firm owners?
Yeah. Just to rewind there a little bit, that whole I'm going to get my profit through growth is a very complex set of psychology there. But we'll just start with people get growth in their mind and profitability falls out of their head. And so there's a lot of layers to that. But I mean, we'll just pretend a person can only focus on one thing at a time. What happens is people are thinking grow, 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 and they're kind of losing focus on profitability. And that's kind of a fair segue into one of the other ones. People often think they're doing things to focus on. I call it the myth of being too busy. And specifically what I mean by that is it's so easy to get caught up in what I'll call it the sausage making, which is a euphemism for various operations. Many of you might have heard of a book called The E-Myth, written by a fellow named Michael Gerber. A key thesis from that book, or a key quote, is you need to be working on the business instead of in the business. So if you're spending your time working in the business, recruiting, sales, operation stuff, things like that, what you're not doing is you're not spending time either by yourself or with your key management team, talking about what are we doing right now to short circuit the problem and get more profitability in the next 30 days. So what I tell people, and I recently posted on this on LinkedIn, is that your calendar is one of the most telling, now I got my language all mixed up, but if you go to your calendar for the last week or two and you can't find several hours dedicated to make more profit now, you're probably not doing everything right when it comes to profitability. That sounds wrong. You're missing the boat on that, because there's almost guaranteed some things that you could do. We might get into that a little bit later as we go on. But I mean, the most obvious one is, where could you be cutting expenses? Where could you be selling high margin products? Those are some of the obvious things. And as an agency owner, it's that's not that it'd be rare that a lot of people are spending a lot of time on how can we spend less on stuff we don't need, like in the last 2 weeks.
Right. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's not a focus on that from agency owners? And I think specifically what I'm asking is, why do you think there's not as many out there that are working, spending enough time working on the business?
So first of all, I won't say nobody's working.
I'm not saying nobody. Yeah, I'm just saying in general, I think that there is a challenge there. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a challenge. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's a great book from a guy named Marshall Goldsmith. It's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. If you think of, the most common route that people become owners of agencies like staffing and recruiting is they probably started off in staffing and recruiting or sales for staffing and recruiting. And that is not a classic like management or accounting or finance or back-end operations kind of a background. And so to some extent, they're more wired to like, let's go hit LinkedIn and find a candidate or something like that than they are to be like, okay, team, we're going to get together and every week between now and Christmas, we're going to cut $5,000 out of the monthly operating budget. So I think it's a little bit of where you came from that is involved in that. And man, being a business owner, it is definitely, it's a noisy place. People are screaming from like every direction. And what I used to say to myself was, the work that chases you doesn't make you money. The work that you go chase makes money. And that was an example of like, I could just sit all day long and like field problems, if you will, from folks on my team, typically like operations. And again, a little bit back to sausage making, or I could, pick up the phone and call my 3 best clients, make sure everything was going great, and ask them if they needed something more.
Yep.
Right. I'm guaranteed to get more like money in my wallet, if you will, in the next 90 days on making those calls than, you know, some kind of ATS problem, or the guy who delivers water or lunch snacks or whatever is doing whatever they're doing. Like, that's not how you build a business generally.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I tend to agree. And yeah, I think your statement of, because most of them are recruiters or salespeople first,
somebody froze.
They haven't gotten that CEO operational type of position, so to speak, yet. So kind of going, you know, before we talk about like the actual, I guess the way I want to say it is like, what common profit boosting strategies do you believe are actually counterproductive?
Oh, didn't see that one coming. Let me think about that for a second. Well, it's kind of a cop-out if I say growing your way out of the problem. I think we kind of covered that in quite a bit of depth. Counterproductive. In kind of a related way, and I think this is a topic that that is applicable both to agency owners as well as recruiters. And bear with me for a second. The first part of this is we're going to grow. But the way that we're going to grow is we're going to chase all opportunities. So, you know, you're doing what you're doing, and then you hear a rec or somebody flashes an opportunity your way, like, hey, could you find me a C# developer who's willing to move to North Dakota and take a 20% increase in pay? Now, man, first it was lacrosse, now we're busting on North Dakota. I don't mean it that way. That was supposed to be a euphemism for a place off the beaten track.
Right.
You know, Fiji, whatever. I guess Fiji sounds good. But I guess my point is, I think everybody in the recruiting world is familiar with, you know, I don't know if you call them purple squirrels or pink unicorns or whatever. It's incredibly tempting when somebody waves a big payday your way in something that is, we'll just say, outside Main Street or your bread and butter or whatever, to go chase that thing. And so that would be an example in my mind of something that's counterproductive. And one of the challenges is often when people are more desperate, it's more appealing to kind of chase that sort of stuff.
Right. 100%.
And so I would say that as a recruiter, you know, there is a delicate balance between, you know, targets of opportunity, like crossing your radar, if you will, and sticking to the knitting, if you will. And I'm a big fan of sticking to the knitting. Mm-hmm. And that is like as an individual recruiter or freelancer or whatnot, but also as an agency owner. Man, once you get, as I call, beyond about 2 commas, it's nearly impossible to explain what you do to somebody. If we do sales, marketing, and this and that, you're probably 1 comma too far. So, you know, a lot of people will then roll that up and they say, we do go to market. And it just sort of reminds me, like when I go backwards and people say, I'm in consulting. You know, I'm not saying you're not, but it's just not a real helpful answer because it covers such a breadth. Right. Now, if you said, I do onshore data analysts who can roll up their sleeves and code SQL, but can also talk to business owners. I mean, I think you just know what I'm doing here. It's not a secret. It's fairly clear. Later on down the road, you might even, God forbid, remember what I said and think of me. Yep. And certainly if I'm just hammering that, I think it makes it easier for me to recruit. People come to me. And let me just chime in on a reinforcing story there. Boy, back in early, 2007 or 8, Mactus Group was kind of the new kid on the block, kind of a little pipsqueak in the marketplace. And people were basically, you know, the unasked question is, why in the heck would I go with you guys? Instead, we had like 30 contractors at that point. Why in the heck would we go with you instead of one of these big behemoths that everybody knows their name in the space? And I'm like, okay, we have 30 people on staff that are in marketing, project, and program management. They might have 1,000 people doing this, but I would stack up our ability to fill marketing, project, and program management 1,000% against them because
Right.
they're filling, we'll just say 30 kinds of roles, 30 people each. I'm doing one kind of role, 30 people. We're already the same size in that niche.
Yep.
And I guarantee you that I can tell better who's good at this work, having been doing it for 20 years and been a hiring manager, than some 22-year-old kid who is in the like throw their stuff against the wall and see what sticks kind of agency.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I know I threw a curveball at you there and you just knocked it out of the park. So I appreciate that. I mean, I couldn't agree more about that kind of shiny object or chasing a purple squirrel. And I mean, that's for me, being a coach in this space, one of the challenges I see is like people just staying focused on their zone of genius is really powerful. And then from a positioning standpoint, and I think when you're in a market and economy like this, I don't want to be the jack of all trades. Master of none. I want to be the master. Just like you're saying, hey, I stack my 30 people against these 1,000 all day long because we're experts at doing this. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me, and I can definitely validate that that's a common challenge. Kind of going into like some stories and insight. Like, can you share a success story where you helped a company make tangible improvements by overcoming one of these myths or implementing some profitable strategies?
But kind of back to that kind of growth myth. A very common scenario is that people have different elements of their company or that are not effectively performing. So a classic example is they have clients that are so tantalizing, they want to take that business, but it's just bad business.
Right.
So I was talking to somebody. So one of the things I will say about ProfitDoctor is we're very interested in gathering intelligence from the CEOs out there. And I'll probably plug it later. But you could send me a DM or follow me on LinkedIn and do the same thing and put something like top challenges in the subject, because we're doing a survey right now on top challenges. And why am I going in there? Man, these were all linked together and I lost track of it with my little plug there. But hit me up on the top challenges. We'll show you how to get signed up for that information. But you asked me
bringing you back. I was just, you have a success story about like some tangible improvements you made.
Exactly.
Yep. And you were
So I was having a nice research interview with a $3 million agency owner about some of their top challenges. And through that conversation, we discussed that they had been chasing, or they had landed this one client that gave them a lot of bulk recs, but those recs were relatively low margin, low percentage recs.
Right.
And so we had a really interesting conversation, and the net effect of that was they essentially fired the client. Now, there's a lot of ways to fire the client. One way to do it is just to not push too hard on those recs. I mean, it depends if it's like contingent or retained, and a lot of nuance in that. But one of the areas that I've had great success working with our clients is for them to be more clear on who their clients should be. And so in this research interview for our kind of top challenges, this one client talked about this one of their clients, right? And then as a net outcome of that, they let that work lapse. They didn't sort of renew it or pursue it or whatever. And they realized how much bandwidth that freed up for them to go after stuff that's on Main Street.
Right.
And if your Main Street fill rate, we'll just make up a number, is 35%, and your crap rec fill rate is 10%, it's like every time you drop one of those recs, you're probably like you just got paid triple,
right.
Focusing on the other one in that math, or maybe 3.5, I forgot my numbers. But so I think that is one of the good ones. And just another one, a little bit very related, but a slightly different industry, is they raise their prices. And when you raise your prices, what will often happen is the people who value you the least will go away.
Right.
Well, if you were looking at your customer portfolio and were wondering, I wonder who we should fire, you'd probably fire the people who valued you the least, because they're always complaining. They're never satisfied. They're paying you they're like paying you late. They're not sending you referrals. Well, if you raise your prices, we'll just pretend 5%, you basically let those clients fire themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I had a client and they raised their prices, and shocker, most of their worst customers that they were trying to raise up the confidence to actually have the firing conversation, they fired themselves. Like,
right.
Yes.
Makes it easier. What do you say then to kind of dig into that? Because I know the first thing that's going to come up for some that have a scarce mindset is like, well, how do I fire clients when I don't have the next one in the pipeline?
Right. First of all, it does take some, something, I don't want to skip over that. And that something is confidence.
Yep.
And that confidence is a core element of, another kind of pillar that we talk about. So let's get back to how do I fire people? If you could just table that for a second.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about mindset for just 1 minute. I've got a whole laundry list of, profitability tips and hacks and that kind of stuff that we work on. But it starts with mindset. And so the first element of mindset, I would say, is dispelling these myths. Well, maybe not the first element. There's one track where it's like dispelling the myths to make sure you know what north looks like and you want to head north. And then there's the mindset that I call mood mastery and confidence building. And so that like profitability focus and mood mastery is what at ProfitDoctor we call winning CEO mindset.
Got it.
So we make a point of pushing there, because you're totally right. If you're in a negative headspace and not feeling good about yourself, it's very challenging to make these quote tough calls,
right.
To cut the parts of your business that are not being effective. So let's see. You were asking me a question about how can you cut if you have a scarce mindset and you don't have more recs to.
Yep.
The first thing is, you almost like get out the calculator and just be clear on what you're cutting.
Right.
So if you're cutting something that, historically should give you a 5% fill rate, the question is, what could you do with the hours?
Right.
If you have nothing better to do with the hours, maybe you should keep on keeping on with that purple squirrel. But hopefully you have other better things to do. I mean, even if other better things to do is to call all your current and past clients, say that a window just opened up in your calendar and you're willing to do personal searches for them right now, assuming they're in Main Street. That's probably better than a 5% hit rate right there.
Right.
And then I will give you a war story. So, one of my clients, it was not staffing and recruiting. But again, it's kind of a service business. And they were rolling in at about $2.5 million a year in terms of run rate. And we looked across the business, and they had 3 service lines. One of those service lines really made them think it was high margin, because what it was is, it's kind of like a staffing business in a way, but they were doing more like consulting prices. So instead of like a 50% markup, it was like a 3x markup. So it seemed so profitable, but they had terrible utilization. And so the actual net profitability, once you really got a little sharper with the calculator, it was not profitable. And somewhat, a win-loss story. They spent a year trying to fix that third of their company until they realized that they had to cut it. So when they cut it, now instead of a two-legged, this is terrible. Anyway, instead of one leg of the 3-legged stool being super wobbly, then they just had 2 strong legs to, I guess, walk on, to make the analogy, get to the end. And essentially they went from like 2.5 million down to about 1.5 million, 1.7 million, but dramatically more profitability. Instead of losing basically $30,000 a month, they were making $20,000 a month. And that was one of the biggest levers that they pulled.
Yep.
So super powerful there. But again, it's all opportunity cost.
Yep.
And it's both for individual recruiters as well as agency owners. I mean, if your number 3 recruiter is chasing purple squirrels, don't you think that recruiter would make you and them more money? Like let's go find more stuff down Main Street.
Yep. 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 Well, yeah. I mean, you free up that time that you're chasing on purple squirrels and put all that into BD, and it's probably still worth more of the time, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little tricky when, you still got to eat.
Yep.
And that almost gets back to, I think it was Rebecca's question about like, when can I, take off on my own?
Right.
Some of it is sort of like, how big's your checkbook? Or your bank account.
Yep.
And starting a business just assume it takes a lot longer and is a lot more expensive than you write down on your Excel spreadsheet to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. Never going to be on our terms.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned, Ben, about like kind of having a good, true north, knowing the direction that you're going. What advice do you have for our listeners, when it comes to kind of realistic profit expectations and goals, or like what are the things from a financials that they should be looking at, maybe that can, indicate good or bad?
I'm tempted to throw out a shameless plug, and we are going to be publishing some benchmarking data.
Okay.
Where you could compare by NAIC code and based on size, how does your set of financials compare to kind of like some composite financials of, let's say, a dozen or 24 other companies in that space?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good one. I guess I would start with, and I actually just had this conversation with a client the other day, and we'll just throw around some rough numbers, and maybe this will be illustrative.
Yeah.
So let's pretend you've got a $2 million recruiting company, a $2 million staffing company, and out of that 2 million, you are spending 70% actually on the people, we'll call them on-site or remote, who are actually doing the work, the billable resources.
Right.
And so let's pretend that's their salary, and maybe you're providing them laptops, and there's taxes and health benefits and all this stuff. Let's just pretend. So $2 million top line, that's $1.4 million to quote your billable payroll. That leaves you with $600,000 left. So where's that 600 going to go? I would probably start with how much of that is going to go into my pocket. Let's pretend that number is 300,000. Maybe it could be a bigger number. So that gives you a kind of a work back number of 300 that should cover everything else. Right. So you kind of start with, what's my gross, like for every dollar I sell, how many dollars, or I guess how many cents will go to like core costs? Again, this is like a staffing business model.
Right.
And then of that remaining margin, where's that going to go? I would start with a chunk of it should go to you. That's why you're in the business.
Right.
And then the other chunk goes to, I don't know, you need a recruiter, and you need an office manager. Maybe you don't need office space anymore, but you need some LinkedIn subscriptions and, I don't know, Google Workspaces and stuff like that, whatever, right? So I think that would be a fair cut. I also think it would be a fair way to start with, maybe you want to be making more money as the business owner than when you were a pretty dang good recruiter or salesperson or marketing manager at some other company before you decided I could do this.
Right.
That would not be a bad straw man, so to speak.
All right, cool. So if you could give one piece of advice to an up and coming recruiting firm owner about profitability, I know we talked about like that, not being so focused on growth. What would be kind of the next step beyond that?
Let me just reel back and throw some caveats about not being so focused on growth.
Okay.
Most of the people that I'm coaching are already kind of in that, have at least eclipsed $1 million, typically 2 million to more like 50 million.
Okay.
And the reason I mention that is to have like a going concern type business, often you need some amount of like market traction.
Right.
And so often I give two caveats on when growth may be more important than profitability. One is if you're a VC-backed SaaS company, solely evaluated based on, top line, endless supply of capital. But that's, give me a sport that's super rare. I don't know, underwater basket weaving, that's the underwater basket weaving of collegiate athletics, if you will, on a percentage basis, right? So that doesn't apply probably to anybody on this call. And then the other one is, if you're in the staffing and recruiting space, maybe getting to that $1 million, and in staffing, because the dollars are inflated is the wrong word, but enlarged based on the fact that you're also carrying the payroll, that number might be 3 or 4, or 2 or 3 or 4. But sometimes getting critical mass in a space is maybe more important than profitability, but not forever, right?
Right.
I mean, I think as a recruiting company, if you've got $1 million of fees in a year, you've already hit a threshold where you have like a minimum scale where you should definitely be focusing on profitability. Staffing at $1 million, that might actually not be hitting critical scale. I mean, in my old business, that was 5 full-time contractors. So that's not really like, paying somebody to run the office and bookkeeping and payroll and allowing me to do sales and recruiting and then a sourcer or whatever,
Yep.
So I think I might have lost track of the question a little bit, but I think the first part was, when is it? Well, we talked about growth, and I was just saying that you said for people starting out, right?
Yep. Yeah. The question was, one piece of advice for upcoming recruiting firm owners about profitability.
Okay. So when we say up and coming, it's possible that growth might even be more important than profitability for, we'll call it that first stage of up and coming.
Right.
I would also just kind of go backwards and just be like, why in the heck do people want to buy from you? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're just literally going to out hustle people, I mean, man, I'm not saying you shouldn't out hustle people, but if that's your full game plan,
you're going to burn out.
I think you want to, I think you could do yourself a favor to add a layer or two to that.
Right.
And probably I would add to that earlier sort of the balance of profitability and growth. Where are you and what needs to come first, and then what comes second. I think we talked about quite a bit already. And then the riches are in the niches.
Okay.
And again, that's an idea of what is Main Street for you. So you're just starting out. I was having this conversation with a recruiter just recently, and there was a very specific area of technical talent that they had been recruiting with for the last 3 or 4 years. And on the surface, it seems like, why not focus on that first? And like, see if you can make a go at that. And so, one way to look at it is like, well, that's just a tiny sliver of the market. And again, yeah, maybe it is a tiny, what are we going to talk about? COBOL programmers, right? So theoretically, I don't know if we'd say COBOL is dead. I don't know if that's true or not. But my guess, there's still a decent chunk of people running COBOL for something. And there's a decent chunk of people who have to do that work.
Right.
So if you are, God's gift to recruiting when it comes to mid-level COBOL programmers who, have government clearance. We got to assume, and I think it's worth verifying, that there's a lot of COBOL systems in the government before I'd go do that. So there is some art in picking that niche. But, if you already have a history in doing that, then I would either probably keep in that niche or maybe find something that's like just one step adjacent.
Right.
You can see I'm aging myself. So maybe COBOL is dead, but maybe Pascal is still got enough going on there.
Right.
But maybe to flip from COBOL to ad agency execs on permanent placement, that might be a bridge too far.
Yep.
So I would probably say, like, speaking of, sticking with your own Main Street, what is close to home, right? Where is your depth and your expertise, and how can you stand out a little bit and show some extra value and expertise?
Love it.
Yep.
As we wind down here, folks, if you guys have any questions, please go into the chat and feel free to ask them. I've got 2 more questions for Ben here. So the first one, Ben, is what are any resources? I know you mentioned the book earlier, but any other resources or books that have shaped your understanding of profitability, as the way you see it right now?
Yeah, it's it's ironic normally when I do Zoom calls with people, I've got the wider screen, and you could see behind me is a bookshelf.
Yeah.
And it's kind of what I consider to be my teaching library. And some of my top books are right up here. And so I would just start with this book called the 80-20 Principle.
Yeah.
Everybody's sort of heard of it, but ironically, very few people do anything with the thinking.
Yep.
And it is essentially a business book version of the Pareto Principle. So I'm a big fan of that one. Another one is this book here called The One Thing, which really reminds you to focus on one thing.
Right.
And it's easy, this kind of tyranny of many. And I think these two top kind of concepts put together very profitable. I'm also a big fan of Profit First with Mike Michalowicz. And for those of you who are familiar with it, there's a little bit of controversy. You know, the thing I would say I would take away is the biggest point of the book is to focus on profitability first, aka as a business owner, figure out how to get paid and work backwards.
Right.
You know, that is like check plus plus for what ProfitDoctor thinks. They do have some techniques for cash management, you know, multiple bank accounts and things like that. I think it can be incredibly powerful for some and maybe not as applicable for some others. But the core number one message, work on getting paid first and go backwards from there. That is a resounding absolutely. And then they've got some very nice tools on kind of measuring your profitability,
Right.
thinking through that. They've got some very good thinking about how to improve your profitability. Big fan. So I actually got certified, or was just about to be certified. You know, I'd done all the training and passed the test and stuff like that. But ultimately, I found that for the niche clients that I was looking for, kind of that $1 to $50 million staffing and recruiting companies, that was not 100% the right path for me to kind of follow. But I do think it's a good book.
Yep. All right. Perfect. Thank you for sharing those resources. And finally, where can our listeners more about your work, the Profit Doctor, and your insights into running a profitable recruiting firm?
Absolutely. What I would say, because I hear in this business, you're only supposed to come up with one call to action instead of 100. You know, probably if you're listening to this on LinkedIn, I would say follow me on LinkedIn. That's where we have a pretty steady drumbeat of outbound content and point to the various things, including that top challenges survey that I was sort of teasing before. If you're watching me on YouTube, we are about to launch a channel that will be at ProfitDoctor Ben. So that would be a great way to find us. We do have a website, unsurprisingly, called ProfitDoctor.com. And if you're an agency owner and you're like, I'm ready to go, you can follow the book a call, or you can email us at support@ProfitDoctor.com. So we're not that hard to find. I think if you start with Profit Doctor and you're still confused, you could type Profit Doctor Ben, and you're only coming to one place.
There we go. Ben, thank you so much for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, take a look, go connect with him on LinkedIn, start following and consuming some of the great resources that he has out there. I want to thank you for showing up and bringing so much value to this show. And you know, we've been here for an hour and packed in a lot. So thank you for your time and being here. What's one last thought, advice that you want to leave us with today, Ben?
So many things. I guess what I would say, and this is also maybe a counterexample from my past, like a war story of like landmines to avoid, rather than look how smart I was, 10 years ago. And I call it managing your gas tank. And so if I were to take a little bit of the wording from Silicon Valley, even though I was kind of trashing some of their business thinking as how it applies to staffing and recruiting, there's this idea of burn rate and fume date. And so if burn rate is how many dollars a month are we spending more than we're earning, outbound cash flow, that is sort of the definition of burn rate. Okay. What people don't say quite as often is called fume date, which is like if you're an airplane heading down at a certain rate, when do you impact the ground or go like negative in your bank account, right? Excuse me. Hopefully we can edit that out later on. Sorry, live audience. So I take that concept of burn rate and fume date and apply that to the store of energy, enthusiasm, and motivation of the owner. So if your business is sucking the life out of you, you have like, we'll just call that your burn rate, right?
Right.
So you are losing, 1 pound of, I don't know if I can say give a shit on the air, so to speak.
Absolutely. Say
But
it.
you're learning you're losing 1 pound. I mean, I don't know if they come in pounds, but one chunk of give a shit every day or every month
Right.
or something like that. And if you've got X pounds like in reserve, right? When do you just you just give the keys back and be like, I'm burnt out, I'm out of here, I'm worthless. Like I
Right.
can't be here anymore. What I would say is, there's a couple of levers in play there. One is you can't wait until you're about to hit bottom and then say, okay, now I'm going to sell it. Because you got to assume that exit process is a several year process, like a year or two to get a buyer and a year or two of some kind of earn out to get paid. And so that puts you, we'll call it 2 to 4 years. Like when you start, smelling burnout, you got to do something to not be there. And then you got to like get out or fix it immediately because, your exit alternative is probably like an exit, like sell it. That's a 2 to 4 year process. So, just rewind, and we're probably way over here. But what the big lesson here, or the rewind lesson, is you have to optimize for your own gas tank. I think I don't know if I'd say most CEOs, a lot of CEOs, including Ben Hansen, circa 2012, was like, I'm willing to absorb suffering because I think it's what I should be doing. And it seems like the right thing to do. I'm going to keep taking shit from this client who belittles me and the team and then clean up after the mess because the money's good or whatever, because I think I'm supposed to, and that's what I'm supposed to do. And I'll suffer for the good of the whatever, blah, blah, blah. What I think people don't understand is, that just increased your burn rate from a half a pound to give a shit a month to a pound.
Right.
And so that just steepened your descent into the ground and cut your burn rate, your fume, the date till you hit ground by half. So I will also tell you, firing that client that gives you no end of crap, boom, you have just improved your trajectory. You are cutting your burn rate. And so I think you can think about that across quite a variety of dimensions across your business. Yeah. So the big lesson I would say is, particularly if you've been at this a few years and it's not all like go, 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 but it's like, oh my God, this is starting to be fatiguing, to optimize almost every decision for, is it putting energy in your tank or is it depleting you?
That's excellent. That is an excellent analogy right there. Ben, thank you so much for closing us off with that awesome one there. If you guys are here with us live still, make sure you tap that like, love, reaction, insightful, and give Ben some love for being here. Make sure you connect with him on LinkedIn. We will be back live next week, same bat time, same bat channel, a different guest, but we'll be here on the Relevant Recruiter Show. Ben, thank you so much for joining and adding value today, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Donnie. Even in my quick conversation from you before this, I derived a ton of value. So I got to imagine that your listeners and clients and so forth are getting the real deal from somebody who knows how to do some really powerful marketing, especially on LinkedIn, and particularly for this sort of staffing and recruiting industry.
I appreciate that, Ben. Thank you. We'll see you guys all next week.